Greetings, spiritual pilgrims. And so we finally come to the end of our time together with Lewis and his Regress. I hope that you fell in love with Lewis, and I hope that you fell in love with his style. I encourage you to read anything and everything that you can get your hands on from Lewis. Of all the writers of Christianity in the last 200 years, I believe that Lewis did indeed find the narrow path that few find. If you have a copy of the book, you will see how many paths there are to the north and south. If you look at the map at the front and the back, you'll see the paths that are there available to the north and the south of the safe, narrow path route in the center. As G.K. Chesterton once wrote, there are an infinite number of angles at which a man can fall, but only one in which he can stand. When Jesus warns us that there is a narrow road that few find, we would be very wise to check our navigation every moment while we remain in constant prayer. In other words, keep the GPS powered. There are billions of people living to the north and south of the road, and there's always a majority of people in the north and the south, unfortunately. There are many churches planted squarely in the realm of the cold dragon, and many churches today find themselves in the realm of the hot dragon. There are many dwarves and boneless men who think they are going to enter into the landlord's castle at the end of their days, if they even believe in a landlord's castle. But they are mistaken. I know that I have overused the Mark Twain quote recently. If you have paid attention to my last several lessons, I love this quote from him. But it really has made an impact on me and helped explain to me why the last 4 years have looked the way they have and why churches everywhere look the way they did. He says that, or Mark Twain says, it is so much easier to fool someone than to convince them that they have been fooled. Isn't that true? Something about the ego gets in the way once somebody has bought into a lie. It becomes very difficult to confess, especially if that lie has become your personal identity, or that lie has caused such damage to those around you that to confess would be quite the cross to bear. That has to be somewhere in the Proverbs, phrased differently. Proverbs 18:2 perhaps, which says, "A fool does not delight in understanding, but only in revealing his own mind." I guess you think that you're wise then, Pastor. No, far from it. I know that I am not. But I do have a leg up on the fool. I do try to submit myself to wisdom. Fools jerk and bray at wisdom's yoke. I was recently reading a Christian forum when on Reddit, I believe, when the foolish Christians were responding to a fool. And they started to say that Christians have no right to vote for what they believe. I heard this from people that I've ministered to for years. Christians have no right to vote for what they believe and force it on others. That is the dumbest thing a Christian can say. Voting in and of itself, whether you are an atheist, a Gnostic, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Christian, or a woke fool, is about voting for your way, and voting for your way in such a way that it will be foisted upon others. And don't let anybody tell you, well, what happens behind closed doors doesn't affect anybody. We have learned otherwise. They're now coming for your children. It's what voting is, genius. The lie that you shouldn't is the other team making a fool out of you. And Christians have been foolish for far too long, and they've been foolish for so long now that snatching the world from hell is now fully in the domain of divine interference. If you don't think that what you believe, if you don't believe that what you believe should be taught to others and used as the measure and the guide for a successful society, then you don't really believe what you say you believe. If you are a Christian, then you believe that there are certain things that are going straight to hell. And if you are a Christian, you believe that there are certain things that cause societies to become sick. And aren't we sick? To not vote for Christian values is just another way of saying, I think the atheists have it righter than we do, and their philosophy should guide the nation, not ours. If you don't think you are right, then please, by all means, get out of the church. You're only damning it. You can find a better concert when Ozzy comes to town, can't you? And you will pay dearly for those that you lead astray with your ignorance and comments in forums like that. They were answering a question to a new Christian. God help them. You will pay dearly for those that you lead astray with your ignorance, with your cowardice, and with your willingness to be led by the nose by people who laugh at you every time you say or type, I shouldn't vote what I believe, because those people over there who are voting for what they believe told me it was unfair to vote what I believe and told me I would be smart and likable if I instead vote what they believe. Time for Christians to stop being stupid, and time for real Christians to stand and vacuum the sanctuary clean. If you hear a Christian say they don't believe you should vote Christianly, then you are not in the presence of a Christian. You are in the presence of a liberal that likes to go to church for aesthetic appeal or for free babysitting, or worse, as a wolf among sheep. Somewhere along the way, religion has gotten redefined as just one more add-on to the secular life. It's a cool place to go to have an emotional outburst and perhaps a moment of catharsis. It's a great place to meet people to go to the lake with, but don't you dare let the church make real demands on me or anyone else, even if I did swear to God and man to abide. In fact, could you have church when the Boy Scouts aren't meeting? That'd make it easier on me. Gotta have my principles straight, and raise my children right. Lewis's concept of the longing of the heart, or the heart's greatest desire, and this feeling is universal, is very similar to the ontological argument for God. And I'm not going to get all into that. It takes quite a bit to explain, but simply put, and missing many nuances, I know, the ontological argument for God is this: because my mind can conceive of God, there is a God. For you philosophers out there, I know that that is an extremely simplified version of the concept, but I do not wish to travel too far into the cold dragon's territory today. Lewis turns that same argument toward desire. If I have a desire and nothing seems to fill it, or nothing seems to fill it completely, or nothing seems to fill it lastingly, then there must be something out there for which my desire was in and of itself created for. I have questions because there are answers. Therefore, I have desire because there are things that will fill that desire. I have thirst because there is water or liquid to drink. And because it was created for that thing, because our desire, our deepest desire, was created for that unnameable thing, it will not find satisfaction until it receives that very thing. Jesus points to that thing himself constantly in his teachings. No other peg will fit, so to say. Everything else is a square peg trying to get into a round hole. And because God and nature do not waste creative energy to fool us with red herrings, that thing must be out there somewhere just waiting for us to allow it to sit upon our heart's siege perilous. Siege perilous, of course, is the seat at the round table that Merlin reserved for the knight who would one day be victorious in his or her search for the Holy Grail. In this last half of the Afterwards that we're going to read today, Lewis assumes a good bit of knowledge from his readers, perhaps too much, which is funny because part of the Afterward was also an apology for requiring so much from his readers. I love Lewis. Anyway, I thought about going through each strange or esoteric word or phrase that he uses, but I think you'll be able to pick up on the context clues and understand enough to be able to flow with his thoughts. One thing that does need to be understood in order to follow this last reading is the concept of dialectic. To put it simply, dialectic is just argument and discussion. Very simple, I know you philosophers. If you picture the hot dragon fighting with the cold dragon, then their tug of war results in the center of the rope being directly over and above the narrow pathway. Or if you are a man at sea, then one wave pushes you back the way you came and vice versa until the storm gets so intense that the waves from either side join and reach harmony in the center. Just like the scripture talks about, don't be a man thrown to and fro, because you have found the center, the narrow path, Jesus Christ. In other words, Jesus Christ is the synthesis of Hegelian dialectic. At least that is what Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14 and 15 tells us long before Hegel. Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth, in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of Him who is the head, that is, Jesus Christ. Our current church problems in the United States, in Europe, and all countries that bought into the satanic lie of wokeism, which Russia is fighting desperately against, are because they are currently in the presence of the southern hot dragon. Northern churches in Lewis's landscape would be synonymous with legalistic and pharisaical churches, while southern churches, we are much more familiar with them, would be churches that ignore the discipline and teachings and law of the church in order to accommodate sinners. Each one is guilty of ignoring certain parts of the Scripture to accommodate other parts of the Scripture and the parts of the Scripture that bolster up their own inner demons. Our trick in the coming days, I hate to use language like that, I don't know how else to phrase it, but the trick that is coming in the coming days is going to be correcting the church's course without over-correcting to the north. And that is going to be very hard. My own shortcomings fall in the direction of overcorrecting to the north. And that is going to be very hard because the southern churches no longer listen to any reason at all. So they must prepare for discipline. And discipline gives rise to disciplinarians. And disciplinarians can sometimes get caught up in their own hype and continue doing their job long after the ship has been set straight. But we are in no danger of that at the moment. So keep fighting the good fight, disciplinarians. Just be sure to never buy your own hype. Do what needs doing. Speak hard, bold truth in these days. And when it is done, set your rod of correction down with joy in your heart. When that day comes, you might and probably will feel directionless a little bit. But God will give you some new work to do if you don't make the terrible mistake of enjoying the work to the degree that you start imposing your own opinions on the penitent. Some of us feel a little too at home on the battlefield. When the narrow path is gained once again, stay outside the camp long enough for the blood rage to subside, and then enter the city gates with peace in your heart, scars on your face, and a story to tell the youth. You will know you have found balance when the little children can come. The trap of the flesh, or the sarx, is quite the labyrinth, with Minotaur at the center for good measure. The narrow road is not to be found looking within, but without. All of the errors along John's journey were filled with people looking within for answers instead of without. Lewis tells us in this Afterward that he himself looked into each and every one of these desires in his life only to find that they were false florimels. Florimel was the epitome of beauty. The real florimel was the epitome of beauty, while the false florimel is just a copy of the true florimel. False florimels cause you to miss the mark, or in biblical terms, when a person is caught stagnant within a false desire, they sin. They miss the mark. This is easily demonstrable by watching as a drug addict keeps increasing the dose of something which no longer fills said desire in the hopes of achieving that bliss once again. The sexual addict, the drug addict, the alcoholic, the social media junkie, all of them are trying to fill the siege perilous with a false florimel. Everyone has heard the story of Perseus and Medusa, or at least I hope everybody's heard the story of Perseus and Medusa. But have you given that story any real thought? The Gorgon, or Medusa, can be seen as the ego. And anytime you try to attack the ego by looking directly at the ego, you will be turned to stone. But if you can destroy it by looking at it indirectly, then you will be victorious in the end. Part of the salvation moment is when the cross of Jesus Christ acts as your shield and allows you to see the hideous nature of your ego without turning within to do so. You see it clearly by looking without, and the only spectacle big enough to achieve that is the crucifixion of God. In other words, looking at the self freezes you as surely as the waters of Narcissus will freeze you when you peer into them. If you turn within, you just freeze up. You stagnate. Nothing to see here. The ego self-defends itself and causes petrification in you in order to preserve its own life. But if you use the shield of Christ and instead destroy the contemplation of the ego, which Christ reflects back at you from His perfect surface and the mirror of the cross, then you have, at that moment, and perhaps that moment only, to slay the Gorgon with the sword of Jesus Christ's sacrifice and His blood, which, when applied to the stone heart, breathes life back into the winter witch's courtyard statues. If we get caught up in driving out the bondmaid servant, we might throw the baby out with the bathwater. But then again, if we quench not the smoking flax, we may allow the wolves to devour the flock. Either vice diminishes the preparatio evangelica, or the preparation of the gospel within the hearts of men. One path straps burdens on others' backs that we ourselves will not carry, while the other path deceives sinners into believing that Jesus saved us from nothing, which makes for a strange religion indeed. Both are enemies of the truth, and both have their historical examples from which to learn. No doubt we and the nation are in the hot dragon's territory today, but let us be mindful to stop the war when neither the frost nor the fire can reach us, but rather keeps us temperate and whole and solid. It will be tempting to get some comeuppance from the boneless men and some justice from the dwarves, but rather let's breathe and relax. Let us hold our false prophets and false shepherds to account, no doubt, and then when that is done, find peace with our brothers and sisters, no matter which foxhole they fought in, for they were as lost as we. Turn to page 211 of Wade's annotated version, or the last half of the Afterward to the 3rd edition, if you have it. Every one of these supposed objects for the desire is inadequate to it. An easy experiment will show that by going to the far hillside, you will get either nothing or else a recurrence of the same desire which sent you thither. A rather more difficult but still possible study of your own memories will prove that by returning to the past, you could not find as a possession that ecstasy which some sudden reminder of the past now moves you to desire. Those remembered moments were either quite commonplace at the time and owe all their enchantment to memory, or else were themselves moments of desiring. The same is true of the things described in the poets and marvelous romancers. The moment we endeavor to think out seriously what it would be like if they were actual, we discover this. When Sir Arthur Conan Doyle claimed to have photographed a fairy, I did not in fact believe it. But the mere making of the claim, the approach of the fairy to within even the hailing distance of actuality, revealed to me at once that if the claim has succeeded, it would have chilled rather than satisfied the desire which fairy literature had hitherto aroused. Once grant your fairy, your enchanted forest, your satyr, faun, wood nymph, and well of immortality real, and amidst all the scientific, social, and practical interest which the discovery would awake, the sweet desire would have disappeared, would have shifted its ground, like the cuckoo's voice or the rainbow's end, and be now calling us from beyond a further hill. With magic in the darker sense as it has been and is actually practiced, we should fare even worse. How, if one had gone that way, had actually called for something, and it had come? What would one feel? Terror? Pride? Guilt? Tingling? Excitement? But what would all that have to do with our sweet desire? It is not at black mass or seance that the blue flower grows. As for the sexual answer, that I suppose to be the most obviously false florimel of all, on whatever plane you take it, it is not what we are looking for. Lust can be gratified. Another personality can become to us our America, our newfound land. A happy marriage can be achieved, but what has any of the three or any mixture of the three to do with that unnameable something, desire for which pierces us like a rapier at the smell of a bonfire, the sound of wild ducks flying overhead, the title of The Well at the World's End, the opening lines of Kubla Khan, the morning cobwebs in late summer, or the noise of falling waves. It appeared to me, therefore, that if a man diligently followed this desire, pursuing the false objects until their falsity appeared, and then resolutely abandoning them, he must come out at last into the clear knowledge that the human soul was made to enjoy some object that is never fully given, nay, cannot even be imagined as given, in our present mode of subjective and spatio-temporal experience. This desire was in the soul as the siege perilous in Arthur's castle, the chair in which only one could sit. And if nature makes nothing in vain, the one who can sit in this chair must exist. I knew only too well how easily the longing accepts false objects and through what dark ways the pursuit of them leads us. But I also saw that the desire itself contains the corrective of all these errors. The only fatal error was to pretend that you had passed from desire to fruition, when in reality you had found either nothing or desire itself, or the satisfaction of some different desire. The dialectic of desire, faithfully followed, would retrieve all mistakes, hid you off from all false paths, and force you not to propound, but to live through a sort of ontological proof. This lived dialectic, and the merely argued dialectic of my philosophical progress, seemed to have converged on one goal. Accordingly, I tried to put them both into my allegory, which thus became a defense of romanticism in my particular sense, as well as of reason and Christianity. After this explanation, the reader will more easily understand, I do not ask him to condone, the bitterness of certain pages in this book. He will realize how the post-war period must have looked to one who had followed such a road as mine. The different intellectual movements of the time were hostile to one another, but the one thing that seemed to unite them all was their common enmity to immortal longings. The direct attack carried out on them from below by those who followed Freud or D.H. Lawrence, I think I could have borne with some temper. What put me out of patience was the scorn which claimed to be from above and which was voiced by the American humanist, the neo-scholastics, and some who wrote for the Criterion. These people seemed to me to be condemning what they did not understand. When they called romanticism nostalgia, I, who had rejected long ago the illusion that the desired object was in the past, felt that they had not even crossed the pons asinorum. In the end, I lost my temper. If I were now writing a book, I could bring the question between those thinkers and myself to a much finer point. One of them described Romanticism as spilled religion. I accept the description, and I agree that he who has religion ought not to spill it. But does it follow that he who finds it spilled should avert his eyes? How if there is a man to whom those bright drops on the floor are the beginning of a trail which, duly followed, will lead him in the end to taste the cup itself? How if no other trail, humanly speaking, were possible? Seen in this light, my 10 years old quarrel both with the counter-romantics on the one hand and with the sub-romantics on the other, the apostles of instinct and even of gibberish, assumes, I trust, a certain permanent interest. Out of this double quarrel came the dominant image of my allegory, the barren, aching rocks of its north, the fetid swamps of its south, and between them, the road on which alone mankind can safely walk. The things I have symbolized by north and south, which are to me equal and opposite evils, each continually strengthened and made plausible by its critique of the other, enter our experience on many different levels. In agriculture, we have to fear both the barren soil and the soil which is irresistibly fertile. In the animal kingdom, the crustacean and the jellyfish represent two low solutions of the problem of existence. In our eating, the palate revolts both from excessive bitter and excessive sweet. In art, we find on the one hand purists and doctrinaires who would rather, like Scaliger, lose 100 beauties than admit a single fault, and who cannot believe anything to be good if the unlearned spontaneously enjoy it. On the other hand, we find the uncritical and slovenly artist who will spoil the whole work rather than deny themselves any indulgence of sentiment or humor or sensationalism. Everyone can pick out among his acquaintance the northern and southern types, the high noses, the compressed lips, pale complexions, dryness and taciturnity of the one, the open mouths, the facile laughter, the garrulity, and, so to speak, general greasiness of the others. The northerners are the men of rigid systems, whether skeptical or dogmatic, aristocrats, stoics, Pharisees, rigorists, signed and sealed members of highly organized parties. The southerners are by their very nature less definable, boneless souls whose doors stand open day and night to almost every visitant, but always with readiest welcome for those, whether Maenad or mystagogue, who offer some sort of intoxication. The delicious tang of the forbidden and the unknown draws them on with fatal attraction. The smudging of all frontiers, the relaxation of all resistances, dream, opium, darkness, death, and the return to the womb. Every feeling is justified by the mere fact that it is felt. For a northerner, every feeling on the same ground is suspect. An arrogant and hasty selectiveness on some narrow a priori basis cuts him off from the source of life. In theology, also, there is a north and a south. The one cries, "Drive out the bond-made sun," and the other, "Quench not the smoking flax." The one exaggerates and the distinctness between grace and nature into a sheer opposition, and by vilifying the higher levels of nature, the real preparatio evangelica, inherent in certain immediately sub-Christian experiences, makes the way hard for those who are at the point of coming in. The other blurs the distinction altogether, flatters mere kindliness into thinking it is charity, and vague optimisms or pantheisms into thinking that they are faith, and makes the way out fatally easy and imperceptible for the budding apostate. The two extremes do not coincide with Romanism to the north and Protestantism to the south. Bart might have been placed among my pale men, and Erasmus might have found himself at home with Mr. Broad. I take our own age to be predominantly northern. I take our present age to be predominantly southern. It is two great northern powers that are tearing each other to pieces on the Don while I write. But the matter is complicated, for the rigid and ruthless system of the Nazis has southern and swamp-like elements at its center. And when our age is southern at all, it is excessively so. D.H. Lawrence and the Surrealists have perhaps reached a point further south than humanity ever reached before. And this is what one would expect. Opposite evils, far from balancing, aggravate each other. The heresies that men leave are hated most. Widespread drunkenness is the father of prohibition, and prohibition of widespread drunkenness. Nature, outraged by one extreme, avenges herself by flying to the other. One can even meet adult males who are not ashamed to attribute their own philosophy to reaction, and do not think the philosophy thereby discredited. With both the North and the South, a man has, I take it, only one concern: to avoid them and hold the main road. We must not hearken to the over-wise or to the over-foolish giant. We were made to be neither cerebral men nor visceral men, but men. Not beasts nor angels, but men. Things at once rational and animal. The fact that, if I say anything in explanation of my North and South, I have to say so much serves to underline a rather important truth about symbols. In the present edition, I have tried to make the book easier by running headline, but I do so with great reluctance. To supply a key to an allegory may encourage that particular misunderstanding of allegory which, as a literary critic, I have elsewhere denounced. It may encourage people to suppose that allegory is a disguise, a way of saying obscurely what could have been said more clearly. But in fact, all good allegory exists not to hide, but to reveal, to make the inner world more palpable by giving it an imagined, concrete embodiment. My headline is there only because my allegory failed. Partly through my own fault, I am now heartily ashamed of the preposterous allegorical filigree on page 96, and partly because modern readers are unfamiliar with the method. But it remains true that whatever the symbols are best, the key is least adequate. For when allegory is at its best, it approaches myth, which must be grasped with the imagination, not with the intellect. If, as I still sometimes hope, my North and South and my Mr. Sensible have some touch of mythical life, then no amount of explanation will quite catch up with their meaning. It is the sort of thing you cannot learn from definition. You must rather get to know it as you get to know a smell or a taste, the atmosphere of a family or a country town, or the personality of an individual. 3 other cautions remain to be given. 1, the map on the inn leaves has puzzled some readers because, as they say, it marks all sorts of places not mentioned in the text. But so do all maps in travel books. John's route is marked with a dotted line. Those who are not interested in the places off that route need not bother about them. They are all half-whimsical attempts to fill in the northern and southern halves of the world with the spiritual phenomena appropriate to them. Most of the names explain themselves. Wainhope is Middle English for despair. Woody and Lyconisos mean Isle of Insanity. Baymenheim is named unfairly after Jacob Boehme or Bayman. Golnashire, Anglo-Saxon Gaul, is the country of lechery. In Trine land, one feels in tune with the infinite. And Zeitgeistheim, of course, is the habitat of the zeitgeist or spirit of the age. Naughtstow is a place that is no good at all. The 2 military railways were meant to symbolize the double attack from hell on the 2 sides of our nature. It was hoped that the roads spreading out from each of the enemy railheads would look rather like claws or tentacles reaching out into the country of man's soul. If you like to put little black arrows pointing south on the 7 northern roads in the fashion of the newspaper war maps, and others pointing north on the 6 southern roads, you will get a clear picture of the Holy War as I see it. You might amuse yourself by deciding where to put them, a question that admits different answers. On the northern front, for example, I should represent the enemy in occupation of Cruel's land and Superbia, and thus threatening the Pale Men with a pincer movement. but I don't claim to know, and doubtless the positions shift every day. 2. The name Mother Kirk was chosen for Christianity is not a very convincing name. Its defect was that it not unnaturally led the reader to attribute to me a much more definite ecclesiastical position than I could really boast of. The book is concerned solely with Christianity as against unbelief. Denominational questions do not come in. 3. In this Afterward, the autobiographical element in John has had to be stressed because the source of the obscurities lay there. But you must not assume that everything in the book is autobiographical. I was attempting to generalize, not to tell people about my own life. C.S. Lewis. Thank you, C.S. Lewis, for all the wisdom you've passed down to us. Thank you for delighting us as children, encouraging us as young adults, cautioning us as old believers, and keeping us such fine company on our spiritual pilgrimage. Next week, we begin our journey through the Confessions. So I bid ye spiritual pilgrims adieu. Christ is King, hail to the King, and Godspeed, confessors.